The winter of 1944 had left Europe in ruins, and though the Allied armies were now pushing deep into German territory, the skies above were still filled with danger. For months the Luftwaffe had been bled dry, yet its remnants refused to yield. From every hidden airfield, desperate German pilots launched sorties against endless waves of American bombers that thundered eastward each morning. It was a dying empire's last act of defiance. Within this maelstrom flew a man who would soon etch his name into legend, Lieutenant William Bill Overstreet Jr., a fighter pilot of the 357 Fighter Group, the famed Yachts Forward Boys. They were the knights of the modern sky, their steeds sleek P-51 Mustangs painted with the red tails and shark mouths that terrified the enemy and inspired every American soldier who looked up. Overstreet had joined the war for adventure, but what he found was chaos, fear, and brotherhood forged in fire. The 357 THS mission was brutally simple: escort the bombers, protect them at all costs. Every morning they took off from muddy English fields still soaked with fog, climbed through the damp gray clouds of the Channel, and met death head-on somewhere over Europe. They flew into the heart of flak storms, into skies so black with smoke that sunlight itself seemed to vanish. By late 40, for the Luftwaffe was cornered, yet even a dying wolf can bite hardest. The Me-109s and FW-190s that remained were flown by men who had survived hundreds of missions. Aces who could kill before their enemy even knew they were being hunted. Bill Overstreet was good, but he was no ace, at least not yet. He was disciplined, methodical, the kind of pilot who trusted his instruments more than luck. But war has a way of finding those destined for legend. His Mustang, nicknamed Berlin Express, had carried him through countless missions: escort runs to Leipzig, bombing raids over Dresden, strafing passes on rail lines that fed the German war machine. Every dent on its silver skin told a story. Every patch was a reminder how thin the line between life and death truly was. The day it happened began like any other. The dawn briefing was hurried, the air heavy with coffee and tension. Their target was a factory complex near Munich, guarded by flak batteries and the remnants of a Luftwaffe wing station nearby. Overstreet's flight of 4 Mustangs was tasked with high cover. They would shepherd a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, those lumbering metal whales that trudged through the sky toward Germany's heart. The bombers relied on their escorts like knights relied on shields. Without them, they were helpless prey. The engines roared to life, propellers slicing through morning mist. The airfield trembled as dozens of fighters rolled down the runway, lifting gracefully into the pale light. Overstreet eased his Mustang upward, watching England fade beneath him. Below, green fields turned to silver clouds. Above, the sun broke through, scattering beams across aluminum wings. It was always the same, a moment of serene beauty before the storm. Halfway across the channel, the chatter on the radio grew sharp. A swarm of radar blips had appeared over the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was up early. "Stay tight, boys," came the voice of Captain Chuck Yeager, already a legend among them. "They're hungry this morning." And hungry they were. Within minutes, contrails streaked across the blue, the first sign of enemy interceptors climbing to meet the bombers. The dance began again, fast, furious, merciless. Overstreet peeled off with his wingman, diving into a knot of swirling fighters. Tracers stitched the air. His machine guns barked. A German plane burst into flames and spiraled downward, trailing smoke like a comet. But victory was fleeting. Another Me-109 appeared out of nowhere, cutting across his nose. The sky was a blur of movement, chaos painted against a canvas of clouds. Then, amid the madness, came a burst of flak. Black puffs erupted near the bombers. Overstreet's wingman was hit. "I'm losing power, Bill," came the voice over the radio, and then silence. Alone now, Overstreet's heart pounded. The battle raged behind him. But he had strayed too far, chasing a fleeing enemy south. Below lay a landscape scarred by war, villages reduced to rubble, rivers reflecting the fire of burning fields. The German pilot ahead of him was skilled, perhaps desperate. He dove low, skimming rooftops, daring the American to follow. Overstreet didn't hesitate. The Mustang screamed after him, wingtips nearly grazing church steeples. Civilians looked up in horror as 2 fighters tore through their skies. Minutes passed in a blur. The chase carried them deeper into German territory, far beyond the planned flight path. Overstreet's fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, but adrenaline drowned out reason. He had locked eyes with his prey. Through the canopy, he could see the black cross on the enemy's tail, gleaming under the afternoon sun. The Mi-109 pilot pulled into a steep climb, tried to shake him. Overstreet matched the move perfectly. The two aircraft clawed upward, engines howling, until thin white contrails streamed behind them like ghostly ribbons. At 20,000 feet, the German rolled inverted and dove sharply. Overstreet followed again. The earth rushed up at terrifying speed. Both planes hurtled downward, the wind screaming past their canopies. Anti-aircraft gunners on the ground opened fire, not caring that one of their own was in the line of fire. The sky blossomed with flak bursts. Overstreet jinked, rolled, evaded, his body crushed under the weight of G-forces. Still he held on. He could see the 109 below, twisting through the smoke. The duel had become personal, a deadly test of nerve and instinct. They burst out of the clouds low over a city. Overstreet blinked through the haze and realized with shock where they were. The skyline ahead was unmistakable, the soaring lattice of the Eiffel Tower. Though Paris had been liberated months earlier, the region still bristled with pockets of German resistance, and Luftwaffe patrols occasionally darted through in reckless defiance. The German pilot, perhaps realizing his days were numbered, chose a final act of bravado. He leveled out, engine screaming, and aimed straight for the monument itself. AT 1st Overstreet thought he was hallucinating. No one would dare such a maneuver, but the Mi-109 kept going, descending lower, faster, until the steel frame of the tower filled the windshield. Spectators on the ground gasped as the German fighters shot beneath the arches in a flash of silver. It seemed impossible. And then, without a flicker of hesitation, Overstreet followed. The Mustang plunged after him, its Merlin engine shrieking. In that instant, the world narrowed to a tunnel of iron and sky. The latticework of the tower blurred past mere feet from his wings. He could hear the roar echoing off metal, smell the heated oil in the cockpit. For a breathless heartbeat, the entire world held still. Then he was through, alive, intact, and closing fast on his quarry. The German tried to climb, but Overstreet had him locked. His thumb pressed the trigger. 6.50 caliber guns erupted in unison. The bullets found their mark. The Mi-109 exploded into a ball of fire, fragments scattering across the Parisian streets. Silence followed. Overstreet banked sharply, rising into the open sky once more. Below, crowds gathered, pointing upward, cheering through tears. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, a duel beneath their city's most sacred symbol, a victory that transcended war. For the first time in years, Parisians had seen an American triumph right above their heads. To them, it was more than a kill. It was hope made visible. Overstreet didn't linger. He knew German flak would soon find him. With his fuel nearly gone, he climbed westward, crossing Allied lines by sheer luck. Hours later, he landed at his base, the Mustang riddled with shrapnel, its fuel tanks dry. When he climbed out, grease-streaked and trembling, the ground crew stared in disbelief. "You look like you flew through hell," one said. Overstreet only smiled faintly. "Close," he replied. "I flew through Paris." The story spread quickly among the 357th group. At first, no one believed it. Flying under the Eiffel Tower sounded like a pilot's tall tale. But reports from French resistance fighters and local witnesses confirmed every word. Newspapers would later call it the most daring flight of the war, and historians would marvel at the physics of it all. The precision, the split-second timing, the nerves of steel required to thread a Mustang through that narrow gap at over 400 miles per hour. But for Overstreet, it was simply another mission, another day cheated from death. As night fell, the base quieted. The bombers returned, battered but intact. The mechanics worked under lantern light, patching bullet holes, refueling for tomorrow's sortie. In the mess hall, men whispered about the pilot who had chased a German to the Eiffel Tower. Some laughed, others shook their heads. Yet beneath their disbelief lay admiration, a silent acknowledgement that courage could still surprise even the bravest among them. Outside, Overstreet stood alone beside his Mustang, staring at the dark sky. The hum of distant engines drifted through the air. He thought about the German pilot, about how two men could share the same sky and yet be enemies. He thought about the city below, scarred but unbroken, and about how the war, despite all its madness, was inching toward an end. He didn't know that his flight would become legend, that decades later his name would be spoken in the same breath as Jaeger, Bong, and Boyington. He didn't know that the French would one day honor him with their highest award. All he knew was that he was alive, and that somewhere in the darkness, another dawn and another mission waited. The story of Overstreet's impossible chase spread faster than any communique. Within days, rumors of the Mustang that flew through Paris reached both Allied and German ears. Among the bomber crews, it was told in low, reverent tones during long, freezing flights over the continent. To the men of the 357 Fighter Group, it became a badge of pride, proof that even in the final months of the war, courage had not dulled under repetition. But across the Rhine, in the operations rooms of the Luftwaffe, the tale ignited fury. German officers refused to believe an American had humiliated one of their own beneath the Eiffel Tower. Yet as reports trickled in, from anti-aircraft units, from local police, from civilians who had watched the fiery crash in Paris, the impossible began to sound uncomfortably real. The Luftwaffe's morale, already fractured by relentless losses, took another invisible hit. If even their best pilots could be hunted to the heart of Europe and destroyed in front of their countrymen, what faith could remain in the Reich's once invincible air arm? While propaganda ministers dismissed it publicly, the High Command privately demanded retaliation. Squadrons were ordered to target American escorts at any cost. The skies over southern Germany soon boiled with renewed ferocity. Outnumbered German formations rose again and again, clawing desperately at the endless streams of silver bombers and the Mustangs guarding them. The air became a crucible of thunder and fire. For Overstreet and his comrades, there was no rest. Each dawn brought another briefing, another map crowded with red arrows pointing toward the enemy's last industrial heartlands, Nuremberg, Regensburg, Berlin. By February 1945, the Mustang reigned supreme. Its long-range tanks allowed it to fly deeper into enemy territory than any fighter before it, escorting bombers all the way to the target and back. For the Luftwaffe, that range was a nightmare. No longer could they ambush bombers after the escorts turned home. Now, wherever German pilots rose, the Mustangs were waiting. Overstreet Squadron became specialists in airfield suppression, diving low after the bombers had dropped, strafing runways, hangars, fuel depots, anything that still moved. Each sortie felt like a race against time, every second measured in tracer fire. The German pilots they faced were no amateurs. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived hundreds of dogfights against Soviet aces. They flew with ruthless precision, conserving ammunition, exploiting every weakness. But by 45, even the best could not overcome the shortage of fuel, spare parts, and experienced wingmen. Their Messerschmitts took off half-armed, engines coughing, barely reaching altitude before the American formation appeared on their radar. The Luftwaffe had become a ghost of its former self, haunted by memories of the days when it ruled the skies over Europe. On one such mission, Overstreet found himself leading a flight toward Regensburg. Intelligence had spotted new jet activity there. Germany's secret weapon, the Me-262 Schwalbe, the first operational jet fighter. Sleek, deadly, and twice as fast as anything in the air, the jet represented Germany's last hope to turn the tide. As his flight approached, they saw them. Silver darts slicing to the horizon, contrails streaking downward like falling stars. The radio erupted with warnings. Bandits, high 12 o'clock. They're fast, real fast. The Me-262 swept past, guns blazing, and vanished before anyone could react. B-17 exploded, its wings sheared off by 30mm cannon shells. Overstreet's instincts kicked in. He knew he couldn't chase a jet outright, but he could catch one during its landing run, when its engines throttled down and its speed dropped. He called his flight. Stay high. Wait for them to turn for home. Minutes later, the German jets disengaged, diving toward a small airfield nestled among pine forests. Overstreet spotted the telltale glint of their wings and dove after them, his Mustang screaming at full throttle. Flak erupted from the ground, but he held steady. As the lead jet touched down, Overstreet's guns flashed. Bullets stitched across the runway, shattering canopies, igniting fuel drums. The airfield became an inferno. He pulled up through a column of smoke, the heat scorching his wings, his heart pounding with the same reckless fire that had carried him under the Eiffel Tower months before. That raid broke another fragment of the Luftwaffe's spirit. Intercept reports showed half the remaining jet squadron destroyed on the ground. The Germans realized that nowhere was safe anymore, not even the airfields they called home. Every morning, the whine of Merlin engines meant doom was coming. And yet, amid all the chaos, the legend of the American who flew through Paris persisted. Propagandists tried to erase it, but soldiers whispered it in trenches, and civilians told it in bomb shelters as proof that even the enemy possessed men of terrifying audacity. It became mythic, a story too astonishing to suppress. For Overstreet, the war had turned into a blur of missions. The front lines moved eastward, and with them went the bombers and their guardians. He barely slept, living off coffee, canned rations, and adrenaline. Letters from home arrived weeks late, edges singed by censors' stamps. Each time he climbed into the cockpit, he wondered if this would be the last time he'd see the world from above. The Mustang had become an extension of his body, its engine's vibrations matching his pulse, its control stick an extension of his heartbeat and march. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, resistance from the Luftwaffe reached a final, desperate crescendo. Operation Bodenplatte, a massive German counterattack on New Year's Day, had already cost him hundreds of planes. Still, remnants of elite units regrouped, launching hit-and-run strikes on Allied airfields. One frigid morning, Overstreet's base came under attack. Sirens wailed as Mi-109 swooped low, strafing parked aircraft. Explosions ripped through hangars. Overstreet sprinted across the tarmac, dodging debris, and jumped into his Mustang as bullets sparked off the ground around him. He gunned the engine, roared down the runway amid chaos, and lifted into the storm. The sky was filled with smoke and tracer fire. Below, the airfield burned. Ahead, for enemy fighters pulled away, engines screaming. Overstreet didn't think. He chased. His guns chattered, cutting down one, then another. The remaining two fled east, but he followed relentlessly, pushed his engine to the edge of failure. They darted through clouds, twisted through valleys, until one clipped a ridge and exploded. The last dove into the trees, vanishing. Overstreet circled, scanning, and then spotted him emerging near a small town. He rolled inverted and dove. A burst of fire, a flash of impact, and it was over. He returned to base hours later to find half the airfield destroyed, but his squadron alive, their spirits unbroken. That night, sitting in the mess hall lit by lanterns, someone painted the Eiffel Tower beneath the Nose Arbor Berlin Express, a symbol of his impossible flight. The mechanics laughed, clinking tin cups together. It wasn't official recognition, but it meant more than any medal. Among fighter pilots, legends were currency, and Overstreet's name had become gold. Even visiting bomber crews asked to shake his hand. Yet he remained quiet, modest, almost uncomfortable with the attention. To him, every mission was just survival. One more sunrise, one more battle endured. Still, word of his actions reached high command. Reports crossed desks in London and Washington. The French liaison officers confirmed the incident in Paris, and whispers began that the Free French government would one day honor him for his bravery. Overstreet brushed it off. There was no time for ceremony. The war wasn't over. Each dawn still carried the same roar of engines, the same cold wind biting through flight suits. By late March, the Allied push into Germany was unstoppable. Cities crumbled beneath endless bombardment. The Luftwaffe, desperate, threw everything it had left into the air. Training cadets, mechanics, even teenage volunteers with barely a dozen flight hours. For every German plane that rose, two fell. And through it all, Overstreet's Mustang prowled the skies, striking rail lines, convoys, bridges, anything that kept the enemy alive. He had stopped counting missions. They blurred together like frames of a single endless film. One afternoon, while returning from a low-level strike, Overstreet encountered a strange sight. Ahead, emerging from a bank of smoke, came a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s. 6 of them, flying tight. They hadn't seen him yet. He dove from the sun, opening fire. 2 exploded instantly, the rest scattered. What followed was one of the most intense dogfights of his career. The airspace above the Black Forest became a swirling arena of death. He traded bursts at point-blank range, dodged trees, rolled through canyons. When the last enemy finally fell, he looked around and realized he was utterly alone. Not a friendly plane in sight. Fuel nearly gone. Over territory still crawling with enemy soldiers. For 40 minutes he flew blind, hugging the terrain, dodging flak towers till the Glen of Rhine appeared ahead. Crossing into Allied airspace, his engine sputtered, empty tanks. He managed to glide the Mustang onto a makeshift strip near Strasbourg, landing hard but safe. Mechanics rushed forward in disbelief. He climbed out, soaked in sweat and oil, the Mustang's wings peppered with holes. "You're out of your mind," one shouted. Overstreet laughed hoarsely. "Tell that to the guy who tried to outturn me," he said. That night he sat beneath the wing of Berlin Express, staring at the stars. Somewhere far to the east, the war's final battles were raging. He could feel it. The end was near. But endings in war were never clean. Every pilot knew that the last days could be the most dangerous, when complacency and exhaustion claimed more lives than bullets. He promised himself to stay sharp, to bring his machine and his men home alive. What he didn't know was that the Luftwaffe's commanders, humiliated and desperate, had quietly put a price on his head. Allied intelligence intercepted communications describing the American who dishonored our pilots in Paris. They wanted him dead, not for strategic value, but for revenge. Yet by the time those orders reached operational units, there was no Luftwaffe left capable of carrying them out. The legend of the Mustang through the Eiffel Tower had become both curse and epitaph for Germany's once mighty Air Force. As spring melted into April 1945, the thunder of engines that had ruled Europe for 6 years began to fade. The once mighty Luftwaffe had withered to scraps of squadrons scattered across smoking airfields, its veteran pilots dead, captured, or grounded for lack of fuel. Every sortie felt like a ghost's echo, and through that fading storm still flew a handful of Allied fighters, among them Captain William Overstreet Jr., whose name had quietly become shorthand for the impossible. When the order came to escort one of the final bomber formations toward Berlin, there was no ceremony, no grand farewell. Just another dawn, another mission sheet pinned to a board, another cup of bitter coffee swallowed in silence. Yet everyone knew history was breathing down their necks. The war's end was visible now on the horizon, like a sunrise seen from 30,000 feet. They lifted off in tight formation, sunlight glinting on aluminum skin scarred by years of combat. Below them, Germany lay broken, bridges twisted into rivers, rail lines sliced, cities reduced to gray dust. Anti-aircraft guns still spat defiance, but even their rhythm was tired. Overstreet led his section with practiced calm, scanning the skies for one last ambush that never came. The radio stayed eerily quiet, punctuated only by static and the soft hum of engines. Somewhere behind the clouds, the bombers released their final payloads on the capital of a dying empire. Then, as the formation turned for home, a single bandit appeared, a Messerschmitt 109, its paint scorched, its pilot probably barely 20. It charged headlong into the swarm of Mustangs like a moth into flame. Overstreet rolled, dove, and fired once. The German's canopy flashed, then disintegrated. A parachute bloomed against the pale sky. Overstreet watched it drift gently down and whispered, "Go home, kid. It's over." When news reached the base that Berlin had fallen and Germany had surrendered, there was no cheering in the barracks, no champagne, no parade, only quiet disbelief. Men sat on the wings of their planes, staring at the horizon as if expecting more orders to come. After so much noise, silence felt heavier than battle. Overstreet walked along the flight line, running his hand over the bullet-pocked fuselages of machines that had carried them through hell and back. The Mustang beneath his Palm Berlin Express had survived more missions than anyone could count. Mechanics had patched it so many times it was a mosaic of war, each scar memory. Someone asked what he'd do now that peace had arrived. He smiled faintly. Maybe learn how to sleep again, he said. Demobilization came fast. Pilots turned in their flight gear, signed papers, boarded transports for home. Overstreet returned to the United States a quiet man in a world suddenly loud with victory celebrations. Headlines called men like him heroes, but he never thought of himself that way. Had seen too many friends vanish in fire to claim glory from survival. Still, the story followed him. The unbelievable chase under the Eiffel Tower, the dogfights, the sheer audacity of it all. French officers confirmed it officially in 1945, though it had already traveled halfway around the world as legend. To Parisians, it became a story whispered with pride, how an American pilot humiliated the occupiers in their own sky, defying death and tyranny in one breathtaking act. Years passed. The uniforms faded into closets, the Mustangs into museums. But the legend refused to die. Veterans told it in VFW halls. Journalists retold it in magazines. And decades later, when new generations studied the air war, they found themselves drawn again to that impossible image. A lone fighter diving beneath the Eiffel Tower in pursuit of an enemy. Some doubted it could have happened. Others insisted that even if myth had sweetened the truth, the essence was real. Courage beyond reason. Overstreet himself rarely spoke about it. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "I just did what needed doing." But those who'd flown with him knew it wasn't luck or recklessness. It was conviction, the kind of belief that drives a man through flak, fear, and the narrow steel frame of a monument that symbolized freedom itself. In 2009, more than 6 decades after that day over Paris, France decided the legend deserved its own final salute. At an embassy ceremony in Washington, D.C., a gray-haired man with steady eyes stood straight as a sword while the French ambassador pinned the Legion d'Honneur on his chest, the nation's highest award. Cameras clicked, journalists scribbled, but Overstreet looked almost embarrassed. "I didn't fly for medals," he said softly. "I flew for the men who couldn't come home." The room fell silent, the weight of those words echoing louder than applause. For France, it was more than an award. It was closure, gratitude engraved in silver. For the Americans present, it was a reminder that some stories never fade. They just climb higher into history. Yet behind every legend lies the human cost. In later interviews, Overstreet would speak of how every victory carried the faces of those who never landed. He remembered his wingman who vanished in a flash over Ploesti, the bomber crews who went down burning over Hanover, the young German he watched parachute to earth. He said war taught him that bravery and tragedy are often the same coin flipped in different hands. And still, despite all he'd seen, he never lost his love for flying. Long after retiring, he'd still look up whenever AP-51 thundered overhead, his eyes lighting with the memory of the Merlin's roar. That sound, he'd say, is freedom. When he finally passed away in 2013 at the age of 92, obituaries called him the man who flew beneath the Eiffel Tower. Newspapers from Paris to New York retold the story, and across the world, veterans nodded knowingly. It wasn't just a stunt, it was a symbol. A single act of defiance that captured what the entire air war had been, a struggle between oppression and the relentless human will to be free. In museums, children stared at photographs of the squadron, the polished nose of a Mustang gleaming under lights, and imagined what it must have felt like to twist through that iron lattice with death seconds behind you and liberty shining ahead. Today, more than 80 years since those clouds of smoke drifted over Europe, the legend endures. Historians still debate the fine details. Pilots still analyze the physics. And storytellers still return to that breathtaking moment when one American pilot shocked the entire German Air Force not through sheer firepower, but through impossible courage. For in that act lay something deeper than victory. It was a proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, the sky itself could still bear witness to hope. The Eiffel Tower still stands, silent but eternal, its shadow stretching across a city once enslaved, now forever free. Tourists walk beneath it unaware that once a man in a silver Mustang carved a path of light through its very heart. And somewhere high above, if you listen closely on a clear day, you might still hear the ghostly echo of a Merlin engine whispering through the clouds, carry with it the timeless truth that courage, once unleashed, never truly lands.